From Sugar 23, I'm Angela Ledgerwood, and this is Lit Up. My guest this week is the writer and teacher Laura Warrell. We talk about her novel, Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm, a novel that took her 20 years to write. It brings to life the trumpet player Circus Palmer and the cast of passionate and very willful women in his orbit. The novel is steeped in jazz, and as the title suggests, the rhythms of the music are embedded in the structure and tone of the book. For me, each character felt like they were their own riff that kind of would reverberate and return to the story again and again. In 2019, Laura wrote an essay that went viral for Huffington Post. The title was, "I Gave Up on Love and It Was One of the Best Decisions I Ever Made." Now, I obviously had to ask Laura all about this essay she wrote and also how that really significant decision changed her life. I hope you love this conversation with Laura and I. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I agree with you. It's wonderful to be out in Los Angeles. I got to drive across the city to get here, so I'm thrilled to be talking to you about the book in person. It's great.
Tell me about the journey to get here. You also wrote an exceptional essay in the Los Angeles Review of Books. Sorry to make the connection between LA traffic and your life and frustrations, but yeah, talk us through how you got here.
Sure. Well, let me further that metaphor a little bit. I think it's interesting because the timing of our meeting was perfect because I got to drive across the city and enjoy it, right? So usually the traffic is a nightmare and you're tangled up in it, but I got to see new discoveries. There's this hotel that I've never seen before, some old Hollywood hotel. So if we're going to use that metaphor, I imagine that, well, it's about timing, right? And in some ways I feel there are two ways to look at my journey as a writer. Writing While Black, which was, as you said, published in the Los Angeles Review of Books, was one piece of it. I do feel, unfortunately, that race factors into a lot of career trajectories for creatives. It can be more challenging because industries may not be as diversified or they may not be as comfortable with working with creatives of color or knowing how to position those stories even when they are excited about them. So I do feel like there were challenges that were incredibly difficult, incredibly painful. It felt liberating, but also absolutely terrifying to write that essay. But I felt like I needed to do it for writers in marginalized communities, for artists in marginalized communities to other people have talked about it, but to kind of pull the veil back or the curtain back and say, these are some of the challenges we face, and it's agonizing, and it would be wonderful if they were addressed. But I think the other piece of it that isn't related to cultural dynamics is simply that it took a while to master my voice. I have a voice, I have a style, I have an appreciation for language that I believe has always been kind of hard for me to really gain control over. And I think as a writer or a creative person in general, that's part of the work, right? You've been given this desire to do creative work. Maybe you've been given gifts and you've got to figure out how to use them in a way that it's not only fulfilling for you, but that other people can access your work and your ideas and be touched by what you're trying to share. So that's, I guess, in the abstract, that was the journey. But I like to talk about the practicalities of it. I wrote my first book or finished my first book out of college and tried to get it published. It was terrible, but I tried.
But you did it.
Yeah. And I wrote 4 other books before this book came out. So over the course of 25 years, countless rejections. I don't know how many agents I've queried over the last 25 years. I've totally lost count. I couldn't even imagine trying to put that number together. It took me 2 years to finally get the agent for this book, 50 query letters to agents. And I say that not to signal the violins, cue the violins, but just to push the point that for some people, yeah, it's harder, but don't give up, right? The dream, the goal is attainable. And for some people, yeah, it's going to take you a little bit longer, but you've got to love the work. So I say that with honesty. I want to be frank about how challenging it was, because I feel like for a lot of writers, we don't hear those stories. We more often hear, like, I'm 25, it's my first book. So here's the other story.
Yeah, and also there was a really interesting New York Times article where Lisa Lucas talked about your book. She's just a kind of a goddess in the world of
she is
publishing.
Superstar.
Your book has so many layers to it, and it is about a jazz musician, Circus Palmer, and I'll have you talk about him so much more than me. It's centered around him, but really it's about the women in his life that come in and out of his life,
Yes.
and that reverberate around him. When did he first come to you as a character? And I'm kind of reticent to talk about the man first, because Coco is my love in the book, and Maggie.
Yes.
But I think, why center the book around him and his life, but then how, it was obviously incredibly important for you to make these women sing in the book.
First, I just want to say that I love the idea of the women reverberating around him. Can I borrow that? Can I use that?
Take it.
That's great. So Circus came to me because I was in a relationship with a musician, and it was similar to the relationships that the women have with him in this book. I wanted more out of the relationship that I was getting. There was a lot of mystery around his life because he wasn't as involved with me as I wanted him to be. And at the same time, I was actually reading a book about a womanizer, a playboy. And I just had this moment of feeling like, as interesting as these characters are, as common as their stories are, I feel like we've heard a lot about them, and I'm definitely interested in continuing to know about them, but I'd like to also hear about the women. Very often I think when women are featured in the stories of men, particularly men like this, they are serving his journey. They're serving his hopeful, evolution. And ignoring the fact that these women have their own stories. They have lives going on. I say this a lot as a writer, and I assume a lot of writers are like this. We're kind of living our lives in two realities. One is reality, and the other is as writers. So always sort of observing and judging and interpreting our lives and creating narratives out of them. And so I thought about the fact that this person I was involved with doesn't know me. He doesn't know what's going on in my life. He doesn't know my challenges, what's happening in my family, what's happening in my world as he's kind of walking in and out of it. And I felt like there are really interesting stories there. The women that these men are involved with have lives and challenges and goals and traumas just like the men do, and we never hear about them. And so I wanted to write that book where we turn the camera and we look at the women and we see what's happening in their lives. We see what their concerns are and who they are as full-fledged, three-dimensional human beings.
Well, and one of these women who is the daughter of Circus, so not one of his lovers or a wife, ex-wife. And as I mentioned, I love her.
Yes.
And we follow her through the book through a sexual awakening, but also a coming of age to a certain point, an understanding. There's a very powerful scene. She has a crush on a teacher, which I think if we all cast back, I myself at our all-girls school had a Mr. Plunkett who was the drama teacher.
Okay.
And everyone kind of the energy coming towards that poor man.
Yes.
Oh,
That's true,
if you could bottle that, I mean, we could go to the moon.
Yeah, that's hilarious to think about, but you're absolutely right. Yeah.
But I'd love to hear more about how precious and how careful you had to be when writing about a teenager. And also how you kind of push those limits. Sometimes I felt that she was putting herself in a very precarious, dangerous position, and then you'd pull back And I'd be so relieved that actually she was kind of flexing her power and in control. And I think it'll make everyone who reads your book cast back to their own adolescence of when we put ourselves in those situations, and only as adults we look back and go, oh, we got out scot-free.
Yes.
Whew. Yeah, talk about Coco and how important she is.
It's funny because throughout my journey with this book, whether it's the talking to editors about it who are interested or readers, it's either Team Coco or Team Maggie. Everybody loves those characters. And interestingly, Coco was one of the first characters to emerge. Originally, I was just going to write about the women in his life, lovers, and as you said, Pia, his ex-wife. And then something happened. I don't think this is a spoiler. It's something that happens later in the book. But the Boston Marathon bombing happened, and I was living in Boston. And there were girls who were getting crushes on the younger bomber, and in real life.
Yeah.
And so I thought, oh my gosh, Circus has a daughter. And originally, I was just going to write sort of one chapter about a daughter, but she just is so strong and so powerful a character and force. And her story, her trajectory was so interesting to me that she's a recurring character. And I agree with you that, and there are two ways to sort of look at it. There's the fact of adolescence, particularly that age with girls. She's about 14 years old, where I remember I was totally like this, where I'm raging with hormones and I'm trying to figure out who I am. Ours was Mr. Jarvie in middle school. He was the gym teacher. But yeah, there was always the crush, right, in school. But I think very often kids that age, and I think especially girls, do get themselves into precarious situations because they're trying to figure out who they are. And there's this interesting sort of energy that's really forceful, I think, in girls of that age. And they're either, it seems going to move forward in their lives and retain that sort of strength and sense of purpose and selfhood, or unfortunately sometimes lose it. And I think one of the things that's interesting about Coco is not only that, yes, I bring her up to the edge, right? She's at the precipice in every chapter she features in. And part of that is, to me, the nature of fiction. You can't be nice to your characters. You can't take care of them and coddle them because that's not interesting for fiction. And there are many times where I kind of teared up and silently apologized. I'm sorry, Coco, but you're in a novel. So I've got to, I can't be nice to you all the time. But there's also the fact that as girls are trying to figure out who they are, they're going to get themselves into some dangerous and risky situations. But that's part of the process.
Well, I think for every woman, there's a moment in our lives where we decide enough is enough. Mm-hmm. Well, I say that. And then, sometimes it's harder to stick to that resolve in terms of relationships, or we can fall in love with someone and then things aren't what they seem.
Right.
Which is so heart-wrenching.
Mm-hmm.
Free people. Fashion.
Unique pieces.
Have your own kind of style.
Wear more colorful stuff.
Black t-shirts. I love creating my own look.
Hip, sexy, vintage.
How do I top that?
It's just not so cool to look the same all the time.
Leather all the way.
Comfy, casual.
A pair of big old baggy light wash blue jeans.
Creativity, inspiration.
Free people.
Free people.
Free people.
I want to pivot quickly to another essay you wrote that I was just riveted by in the Huffington Post about deciding to give up on love and the freedom that came with that. It's such an incredible essay, and we'll link to it. But something that in it that I just loved was going to a party. All those times you would go out to, someone else's wedding, a party with an intention. Like, maybe tonight I'll meet someone amazing who changes my life. Or, even when I was a waitress, like a decade ago, I'd be, maybe tonight my life will change.
He'll walk in and sit at my table.
And I thought, if you make a decision that that's not on your agenda, I just read that part of it and I thought, imagine all that time and energy I could have had back to pour into art.
Yes.
It's interesting to write about all these women that are still so tied to love and wanting the attentions of a man, while you yourself really did disentangle yourself from that need and want.
It's interesting because this essay is coming up a lot now, so
It's radically
yeah.
fabulous.
Well, thank you,
Yeah.
thank you. The first thing I'll say is it feels so good to give up on love in that way. And of course, I'm not saying if some wonderful person walked into my life and said, no, sorry, I don't do love anymore. I mean, that's not the point. The point is, as you say, I'm living my life and I'm engaging with people in the situations that I come across naturally and authentically and not worrying about whether or not I meet someone. In fact, I think back to being out with a couple of girlfriends who are younger than me, so there's maybe a little bit more urgency than I feel at my age. And I was just so conscious of our energy. Like the tension that they felt was just emanating that, you know, I want to meet somebody. I want to feel like people are looking at me and that I'm attractive. And I just felt loose, you know? What I'm saying is I'm just here. I'm just existing. I mean, in that need for connection, there's self-criticism and there's discomfort in your own body and there's missing out on whatever it is that's happening around you that could be just as meaningful as meeting the love of your life. That's the first piece. And as far as the book goes, I feel like part of what I wanted to do is give each of these women their moment to decide whether they're going to continue. Right? This is the moment I'm inviting you to liberate yourself or shift the dynamics of this relationship with Circus. Are you going to stick with it? And if so, what are you going to do to position yourself more comfortably, to create a dynamic that's respectful and fair? Or are you going to, you know, move on? Some of the women make choices that readers may consider wise and liberating, and others may consider frustrating, because that's life, right? I mean, if I wrote a book where every woman goes, "You're out of here," that would not be, you know, an accurate representation of human life. But that's what I wanted to do. And sure, as I was disentangling myself from that intense need for partnership and allowing life to just be whatever it was going to be, it made it in some ways easier to write these women's stories because I felt like their friend. And rather than just giving them advice on this is what you should do, I gave them opportunities, right, to make different choices. Some of them listened to me, some of them didn't, but that's how that sort of played out in the book.
Well, one of my favorite parts in the book is a chapter about Carmen. And I thought, yes, here we go. Because so often, Circus is obviously very handsome and, you know, with that talent, being a trumpeter and the way musicians look and feel.
Yes.
And I think it's always so appealing when someone is lost in their craft, in their art. You know, we all want a part of that and we want someone to be as lost with us as they could be, which probably never quite matches up maybe for a moment. Can you describe this fabulous moment where this very accomplished, beautiful woman, Carmen, bumps into her old flame, Circus?
Sure. You know, it's interesting. I told you about the essay, Why Jazz, that came out today in LitHub. A lot of people have asked me why he plays jazz, and I think in part because people don't realize people still play jazz, people still listen to jazz, but you've nailed it. What you said is exactly one of the reasons that I chose jazz, is because it's so engaging. It's, you know, they're just experiencing the music in their bodies. It's incredible to watch. You're connecting on so many different levels as you're watching. So one of the things that I wanted to play around with is, you know, each of these women have to find something uniquely interesting about Circus, right? If every woman likes him for the same reason and has the same motive behind engaging with him, it's not interesting, right? You're basically just telling the same story over and over from 10 different perspectives. So I really had to think about, okay, what does Carmen see in him? What does Maggie see in him? What does Pia get out of the relationship? And so it felt accurate or more authentic to me that some of the women don't necessarily feel that strongly about him, that they're not necessarily deeply connected and invested at the gut level. I also thought it would be fun to kind of play with this idea that I think happens a lot of going back to relationships or reconnecting with someone that you had a certain experience of love with and coming to find out that they weren't experiencing it that way. I wanted to do that to Circus. So Carmen is somebody that he sort of thinks of as his first love. And I've met a lot of men, I'm actually related to one, who have told me, you fall in love once, men fall in love once, and if it doesn't go well, that's it, right? And so I kind of wanted to play with that, and that's Carmen for Circus, his first love. So in the first chapter, Maggie, who's kind of his most beloved bedmate, tells him she's pregnant, and he leaves her and moves forward in relationships and connecting and reconnecting with the other women in his life. So he's already been on that path a little bit by the time he runs into Carmen. And so I thought it would be interesting to see what happens to him when he connects with someone who he thinks is his great love and she sees it differently. Because part of what's happening in this book is, yes, each woman has her trajectory, she has her arc, but then Circus also has an arc. What is he going to do? You know, what decision is he going to make? How is he going to evolve after this initial moment with Maggie and this pregnancy? And so Carmen is a part of that. So she's going to be one of those women in the book who doesn't think he's the cat's meow, who doesn't think he's the greatest thing. So how is that going to change him? How is that going to affect his journey? And how are we as readers going to understand him differently when we come across women who don't think he's the end-all be-all?
Well, it's also great to put someone in their place. There's nothing better than, isn't it, coming across someone who you thought you'd really liked, but you'd also kind of done all the right things.
Yes.
And they hadn't broken up with you kindly or
Yes.
properly. And then with those years, you just start to realize what an idiot they were.
Yeah.
And arrogant, not that smart,
Right.
not that talented.
Oh, God, yes.
And you've kind of moved on so
Yeah.
much. And then you get an opportunity to see them. There was just a line that I loved where Carmen says, I'll be paraphrasing it, when she says, I live in London now and I run my own dance company. I live with my husband in London. That was after Paris and after New York and I thought, yes.
Yeah.
I'm like, and it was a great balance because
Yeah.
I felt at that point in the novel I was like, wait a second.
Right.
This guy,
Right.
he can't be all that.
Right.
You talk about that, the overarching arc
Yeah.
of Circus's trajectory, and I needed that then.
Great. I'm glad to hear it.
thank you.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. And I love your reading of Carmen because that's how I saw her. So I imagine their relationship, that she was really into him at the time.
Yeah,
and she
like
was
you are in college.
Exactly. And you think you're deeply in love and you're connecting, at levels that you didn't even know were possible, and you're giving your all, and this person is not capable of receiving it. And then, just as you said, you grow up and you realize, what was I thinking? That guy's not that interesting or smart or talented or intense. But then as you sort of move forward, very often that person, and of course it's not only men, that person, whoever it was, might still think of you as like, you're the one who got away because of how much you were giving of them and how spectacular you were, right? And that's how I see Carmen. She's spectacular. And she went on to a very spectacular life. And he didn't really. So it is a really interesting moment. And I think that in some ways she probably does have some satisfaction in kind of saying, so are you still,
Yeah, not thinking
what are you
about,
doing
yeah,
now
yeah.
compared to my very exciting dynamic life? But I also feel like she really means it when she says, I don't really see it that way. That's not how I see things. So again, I didn't want to write a book where this jerk gets his comeuppance, right? That didn't seem fair. It didn't seem very compelling. But I did want him to be confronted with the consequences in the lives of the women that he has touched. And sometimes those consequences aren't going to feel good for him. But hopefully they do aid him in his evolution and as he decides what he's going to do about what he sees as a problem in his life, which is Maggie being pregnant.
There's just something wonderful about when Carmen doesn't look back. You know, when people part
Yes.
and there's the look back or the
Right.
not look back. But I know in my own life, I think I've walked off
Yeah.
and held that head
Yes.
straight
Yeah.
and not looked back and just gone, and off I go.
Right.
And there's such satisfaction in that.
Yeah. I mean, I've had some moments like that too, where I've, and one of the reasons that I wrote this book, and I think about this a lot on a lot of different aspects of our lives, is if we knew how we impacted each other. I mean, every person on the planet has probably had a heartbreak that is so devastating that you don't think you're going to survive, right? And you're just sitting in your room, sobbing your eyes out, your guts wrenched. And I have the thought, like, if he knew that this is what was happening to me right now because of our relationship, would he behave differently? Would he have behaved differently? And that was one of the things that I thought about when I wrote this book. And so I think that there is that satisfaction too, if you've had that kind of heartbreak or you've been mistreated by someone that you cared about and you tried to love. There is some satisfaction in that walking away. And there is that moment of, I will not turn back. Maybe I want to, but I won't. Or I don't want to turn back. And so I wanted to have one of those moments. One of the ones that I had was somebody that I did like a lot. And like you said, as years passed, I was like, who was that guy? Like, why was I even that into him? I have no idea who he is, really. But when we parted, I looked back, and not only did he not look back, he was gone. Like he had evaporated. And I was like, well, I guess that's a sign that that's definitely over. So I like that moment too with Carmen. And I think it's a gut punch to Circus, and he needs some gut punches. And not, again, that I'm seeking some kind of punishment for this character, but more, I want him to grow. I love Circus. I get him. I understand him. I care about him. I wanted to treat him fairly. I wanted to give him dimension and also invite him to evolve.
Reading the book definitely made me think of how I'd treated people in relationships, how I'd ended things. And hoping that I had done it in a kind way. It does matter. It does matter. How we treat one another does matter. I want to know, what were you listening to when you wrote this book?
So it's interesting. I was listening to every kind of music, and I believe we're going to put together a Spotify list.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, I've finished it. I think we're doing it. When it's going to be in the world, I'm not sure. And initially, we were thinking of doing, the publisher and I were thinking of doing just a jazz playlist. So for sure, I was listening to a lot of jazz. I really I'm not going to surprise anybody with like some obscure jazz reference, Coltrane, Mingus, Thelonious Monk, of course, Miles Davis. I was listening to a lot of that. And then I listened to jazz musicians that I think Circus liked, which included all of those guys, as well as Lee Morgan, Charlie Parker. But what helps me when I write, regardless of the subject matter, like I'm working on the next novel, there are no musicians in it, but I listen to music that either I think the characters would like or music that to me just sounds like them. I'm not a musician, but music and sound just really affects me. And so, for instance, with Pia, Circus's ex-wife, she listens to like 90s songstresses like Tori Amos and the Cranberries and Jewel. And so I would listen to that music when I wrote her character. And then characters like, well, Peach, who's a bartender who Circus connects with, she's really into like guitars. So I was listening to a lot of the Black Keys. I felt like she loves the Black Keys. And of course there's probably a gap in my knowledge, right? Because I know, in fact, when I sent the playlist to my publishers, like a lot of these are sort of older. There's not a lot of contemporary stuff here, which probably speaks a little bit more to my
but that's
limitations, but it's the characters. So I really listen to music that I think they liked. And then I also like my students at Berklee, the Berklee College of Music, told me that it's down tempo. I didn't know that, but my students told me that. So that's music like 07 and the sort of acid jazz chill, channel on Spotify. And like I said, there would be music that just sounded like the characters. Whether or not they would like it didn't necessarily factor in.
So I'm going to ask my last question, which is, what lights you up?
Oh my gosh.
Could be anything.
What lights me up?
Yeah.
I guess the first thing that's coming to mind is other people's creativity. When I need to feel alive, I go to a museum, I go to a gallery, I go to a concert, I go to a film. I get so excited by the human spirit as it expresses itself in art. It really is satisfying to me. And like I said, even when there are days that I'm not necessarily feeling in need of any kind of emotional shift, if I go to a museum, if I go to a gallery, if I, hear a good piece of music, just my heart opens up. But then also I was just talking to a friend who is visiting Los Angeles from the East Coast, and we talked about I live by Griffith Park, and being able to take a hike, being able to go to the beach on the other side of town, being in nature, right? And really good conversation. In fact, going back to romance, I did go on a date. Well, I've been on a few dates, not just one. But even though I've given up on love, when it walks into my life, I say, all right, we'll give it a shot. And I was out with somebody and realized, wow, I really like conversation because we're not having one. And you're making me realize how important and how exciting it is. And I just feel so good when I'm having a really interesting, engaged conversation with another human being and learning about who that person is and what makes them tick.
That's a beautiful answer. I want to just follow on that. Is there a visual artist that you return to? There's definitely artists that I return to.
Yeah.
I love the work of Richard Diepenkorn, who's a California artist from his primary years were the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He does a lot of figurative work, but he's known for his abstractions of kind of Ocean Park, the kind of undulations of the road down towards the water. And I always just go to a book like that and it calms me down so much.
I guess what I would answer is I am not as learned about visual arts. And so I'm sort of the person who kind of enters the gallery or museum and just lets it wash over me. I think it's really amusing to talk about art as a creative person and coming up against your limitations, because I feel like I can talk about writing until I'm blue in the face. I also feel like I can speak fairly intelligently about music and maybe even film, but I'm just a very limited sort of appreciator of the visual arts. Like I'll stand in front of something and I really like the colors, it's pretty, but it's still impacting me. I just moved to Los Feliz, and so I'm putting up art on my walls. And I like the German Impressionists. I don't know why. I mean, I did live in Germany for a while, but I remember going to an exhibition at one of the museums at Harvard when I lived in Boston, and I walked through and it's like, every single thing in here I love. I don't know what that says about me. And I also have just European culture I do like a lot of. So that's part of it. I have a Modigliani on my wall, one of the nudes. And Kandinsky I have on my wall, although that's old. I've had that for a long time. I might want to replace it. But I like figures. I like people. I had a roommate years ago. I moved into her apartment, and she just had a lot of like abstract, blocky art on the walls. And when I took over, I was like, people, I need color, I need figures, I need bodies.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
Well, Laura, thank you so much.
Thank
what a
you.
beautiful morning.
Yes, this is a great way to spend a morning.
Oh.
Yeah, I'll do this. I'll come over every Tuesday.
Exactly. Lit Up is a podcast from Sugar 23. It's hosted by me, Angela Ledgerwood, and is produced by Liam Billingham. Olivia Allmeyer is the marketing and editorial consultant. Mike Mayer and Michael Sugar are the executive producers. Andrei Radovsky wrote the theme music. See you in 2 weeks.